The crack of a whip echoed through the evening air as Eliza Goodwin clutched her swollen belly, watching the dust cloud billow behind the departing wagon. Her heart shattered as the reality set in. She had been abandoned at Dry Creek Crossroads, Wyoming territory, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. It was June 1875, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape, painting her dire situation in shades of gold and crimson that belied the cold terror gripping her soul. "He promised," she whispered, her voice breaking as she lowered herself onto a weathered boulder at the crossroads. 5 months pregnant, exhausted, and now completely alone, Eliza closed her eyes against the threatening tears. Her husband of 8 months, Theodore, had gambled away their money in Cheyenne and, in a final act of cowardice, abandoned her when she refused to return east to her disapproving family. The distant howl of a coyote sent a shiver down her spine. Night would fall soon, and with it, the desert cold. Eliza had no food, no water, and nowhere to go. She placed a protective hand over her belly. "I'll keep you safe," she promised her unborn child, though she had no idea how she would accomplish such a feat. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense. Travelers on this lonely stretch of road could mean salvation or danger. Eliza straightened her back, determined not to appear as vulnerable as she felt. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the sunset. As he drew closer, she could make out a broad-shouldered man atop a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a worn leather hat. The rider slowed as he approached the crossroads, clearly surprised to see a woman sitting alone as dusk gathered. He pulled his horse to a stop several paces from her. "Madam," his voice was deep but gentle, carrying the rough edges of a man accustomed to the frontier. "You all right?" Eliza looked up at him, pride momentarily battling with desperation. "I find myself in difficult circumstances, sir." The man dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. As he stepped closer, the fading light revealed a rugged face with kind eyes. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way, but something about his weathered features suggested reliability, a quality Eliza had found sorely lacking in Theodore. "Mason Jackson," he introduced himself, removing his hat respectfully. "Most folks call me Mace." "Eliza Goodwin," she replied, unconsciously running a hand over her rounded belly. Mason's eyes followed the movement, understanding dawning on his face. "You're in a family way," it wasn't a question, "and you're out here alone." Eliza fought the trembling in her voice. "My husband decided I was more burden than wife. He left me here not an hour ago." Mason's expression hardened. "A man who'd leave his pregnant wife to die deserves to be horsewhipped." The blunt assessment startled a laugh from Eliza despite everything. "I'd not disagree with that sentiment." Mason glanced at the darkening sky, then back to the crossroads. "Nearest town is Westcliff, about 15 miles south. You got family there?" "I have no one," Eliza admitted. "Nowhere to go." Mason considered her for a long moment, then reached a decision. "My ranch is 8 miles west. Got a spare room and enough supplies. You're welcome to stay until you sort things out." Suspicion flared in Eliza's mind she'd trusted too easily before. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because my mother raised me better than to leave a woman and child to the wolves," he said simply. "And because I've seen what happens to folks who get stranded out here." There was something in his voice that spoke of personal experience, a shadow of old pain. Eliza weighed her options, which were pitifully few. Stay and face certain death, or trust this stranger who might, at the very least, get her to safety. "Thank you," she said finally. Mason nodded once, then helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode away from the crossroads, Eliza couldn't know that this spot, this unremarkable junction of dirt roads, would come to mean everything to her. 8 miles of silent riding later, they crested a small rise to reveal a modest homestead nestled against the base of rolling foothills. A single-story cabin with a front porch stood beside a small barn. Beyond these structures stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the moonlight. "It ain't much," Mason said as they approached, "but it's solid and it's mine." "It looks wonderful," Eliza replied honestly. After the day she'd had, the little cabin seemed like a palace. Mason helped her down and led her inside. The cabin was simple but tidy: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. The furnishings were sparse but sturdy, all handcrafted with evident care. "I'll get a fire going," Mason said, moving to the hearth. "Spare bedrooms through there, been using it for storage, but there's a bed." Eliza stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of how completely she was at this man's mercy. "Mr. Jackson, I don't know how to repay your kindness." Mason looked up from where he was arranging kindling. "No need for that Mr. Jackson business, and there's nothing to repay. Any decent man would do the same." "I've recently discovered that decent men are rarer than one might hope," she replied with unexpected bitterness. A small smile touched Mason's lips. "Can't argue with that." He struck a match and the kindling caught quickly. "You hungry? Got some stew left from this morning." Only when he mentioned food did Eliza realize how famished she was. "Yes, please, if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble." He moved to the kitchen area and stirred the contents of a pot hanging by the fireplace. "How far along are you?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. 5 months, Eliza answered, lowering herself carefully onto a wooden chair. "The baby should come in October." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "My sister had 3 young'uns before she passed. Tough business bringing life into this world." The casual mention of death during childbirth sent a chill through Eliza. It was a fear she'd carried since learning of her condition, one that Theodore had dismissed as womanly hysteria. Mason must have read her expression. "I'm sorry, shouldn't have mentioned that." "No, it's a reality I must face," Eliza said, "though I'd hope not to face it alone." "You got plans?" Mason asked, ladling stew into a bowl. "Once you've rested, I mean." Eliza accepted the bowl with murmured thanks. "I have skills, I can sew, cook, keep accounts." Perhaps someone in Westcliff might need such services. Mason sat across from her with his own bowl. "Westcliff's growing, but it's still small. Jobs for women are scarce unless you're willing to work at the saloon." Eliza's face must have revealed her horror at the suggestion. "Which I'm guessing you aren't," Mason added. "You're welcome to stay here until after the baby comes. I could use help with the place and you'd have food and shelter." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Eliza asked again, unable to comprehend such generosity. Mason stirred his stew, avoiding her gaze. 3 years ago, I was caught in a blizzard up north. A Shoshone family took me in, nursed me back from frostbite that should have taken my fingers. They didn't know me anything." He finally looked up at her. "Sometimes folks just need help. That's all there is to it." Eliza studied him, finding no deceit in his frank gaze. "Then I accept your offer with gratitude." They ate in companionable silence. After the meal, Mason showed her to the spare room. It was small, with crates stacked against one wall, but the bed looked clean and comfortable. "I'll clear those out tomorrow," he promised. "There are extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold." Left alone, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. That morning, she'd awakened beside a husband she'd begun to fear. Now she was in a stranger's home, dependent on his goodwill. Yet somehow she felt safer than she had in months. She placed both hands on her stomach, feeling the baby stir. "We'll be all right," she whispered, hoping it wasn't a lie. In the following days, Eliza and Mason established a cautious routine. She took over the cooking and mending, grateful to be useful. Mason worked from dawn till dusk, tending his small herd of cattle and making repairs around the property. He was unfailingly polite but maintained a respectful distance, never entering her room or making her feel uncomfortable. 2 weeks after her arrival, Eliza was hanging laundry when Mason rode in from checking fence lines. He dismounted and approached, looking troubled. "Riders coming," he said. "3 of them, might be nothing, but best if you wait inside." Eliza nodded and hurried into the cabin, heart pounding. From the window, she watched as 3 men on horseback approached. Their clothing and manner marked them as cowboys, but something in their posture set her on edge. Mason stood in the yard, one hand resting near the revolver on his hip. The men reined in, and the leader, a sallow-faced man with a patchy beard, spoke. "You Jackson?" Mason nodded once. "That's right. Name's Durbin. We're riding for the Triangle D." The man's eyes drifted toward the cabin. "Heard you got a woman staying with you, pretty thing with a baby on the way." Eliza stepped back from the window, a chill running down her spine. News traveled fast on the frontier, but this felt deliberate. Outside, Mason's posture stiffened. "My business is my own." Durbin smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Thing is, we're looking for a woman matching that description. Husband's mighty worried about her, says she ran off with their savings. Eliza's breath caught. Theodore was looking for her, or more likely, had invented a story to avoid explaining how he'd abandoned his pregnant wife. Mason's voice remained steady. The lady staying with me was left at Dry Creek Crossroads by a man who rode off and left her to die. If that's her husband, he's lucky I haven't found him yet. Durbin exchanged glances with his companions. Sounds like a misunderstanding. Maybe we should talk to the lady, straighten things out. She's not receiving visitors, Mason said flatly, and you boys are trespassing on my land. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Eliza held her breath, knowing these men could easily overpower Mason if they chose to. Finally, Durbin spat on the ground. We'll be back with the sheriff. Her husband's got rights. You do that, Mason replied evenly. Sheriff Porter knows me well enough. He'll be interested to hear how a man abandons his pregnant wife at a crossroads. The mention of the sheriff's name seemed to give Durbin pause. After a moment of tense silence, he wheeled his horse around. This ain't over, Jackson. Eliza watched them ride away, trembling with fear and anger. When Mason entered the cabin, she confronted him. Theodore sent them. He's trying to save face by claiming I stole from him. Mason's expression was grim. Figured as much. Men like that can't stand looking weak. He removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. We should ride into Westcliff tomorrow, talk to Sheriff Porter before those men poison the well, get your side of the story on record. Will the sheriff believe me over Theodore? Eliza asked, doubt creeping into her voice. Porter's a fair man, Mason said, and abandoning a woman in your condition. Well, that won't sit right with most folks around here. He hesitated. There's something else we should consider. If you're planning to stay in these parts, you might be safer with the law on your side. Might want to file for divorce. The word hung in the air between them. Divorce was scandalous, nearly unthinkable for a respectable woman. But then, Eliza had already crossed so many boundaries of propriety by living under Mason's roof. I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, Eliza lay awake long after the house had gone silent. The baby kicked restlessly, perhaps sensing her anxiety. She thought about Theodore, about the charming man who had courted her in Boston, promising adventure and partnership in the West. The transformation from attentive suitor to cold, controlling husband had been so gradual she'd barely noticed until it was too late. And now there was Mason, quiet, steady, asking nothing of her yet offering safety when she needed it most. She barely knew him, yet in some ways, she trusted him more than she'd ever trusted Theodore. The journey to Westcliff the next morning took over 2 hours in Mason's wagon. Eliza had insisted on coming despite Mason's concerns about the rough road. As they crested the final hill, the town spread before them, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church spire rising at one end. Not much compared to Boston, I expect, Mason commented. Eliza smiled. It's perfect. Reminds me that I'm far from my old life. They drew curious stares as they made their way to the sheriff's office. Eliza was acutely aware of her condition and her unmarried status beside Mason. The weight of judgment felt heavier than her pregnancy. Sheriff Porter was a weathered man with a silver mustache and shrewd eyes. He listened without interruption as Eliza recounted Theodore's abandonment, then Mason's rescue. I know the Dry Creek Crossroads, Porter said when she'd finished. Nothing there for miles, leaving anyone there, let alone an expectant mother. He shook his head. That's as good as murder in my book. Relief washed over Eliza. Then you believe me? I've got no reason not to, Mrs. Goodwin, and I've known Mason here since he settled in the territory. If he vouches for you, that carries weight. Some men came by yesterday, Mason explained. Claiming her husband was looking for her, said she stole from him. Porter's eyes narrowed. Durbin and his crew, they were in town yesterday asking questions. He turned to Eliza. Your husband, is he a tall man, sandy hair, speaks with an Eastern accent? Eliza's heart sank. Yes, that's Theodore. He's in town, Porter confirmed. Staying at the hotel, been telling anyone who'll listen how his wife went mad with the pregnancy and ran off. Anger flared in Eliza's chest. That's a lie, I suspected as much, Porter said. Man drinks too much and keeps changing his story. He studied Eliza thoughtfully. You mentioned divorce. That's your right, especially given the circumstances. Judge Willoughby comes through town once a month. He'll be here next week if you want to file papers. Mason cleared his throat. What about those men? They made threats. I'll have a word with them, Porter promised, and with your husband, make it clear that harassing you would be unwise. He paused. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Goodwin, a divorce will be public. There will be talk. There's already talk, Eliza said with resignation. I'd rather be divorced and gossiped about than legally bound to a man who left me to die. As they left the sheriff's office, Eliza felt both lighter and heavier, relieved to have the law on her side, but burdened by the knowledge that Theodore was so near. They were heading back to the wagon when a familiar voice called her name. Eliza. She froze, then turned slowly to face Theodore Goodwin. He stood in the middle of the street, swaying slightly drunk even at this early hour. His once handsome face was flushed, his clothing rumpled. Come home, Eliza, he said, attempting to soften his voice. I forgive you for running away. Mason stepped protectively closer to Eliza. You need to move on, mister. The lady doesn't want to talk to you. Theodore's gaze flicked dismissively over Mason before returning to Eliza. Is this your new protector? Did you spread your legs for him like the whore you are? Gasps rose from passers-by. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face at the public accusation. Mason moved forward, fists clenched, but Eliza caught his arm. He's not worth it, she whispered. Listen to your slut, Theodore sneered. She knows I'd destroy you. Sheriff Porter emerged from his office, hand on his holstered gun. That's enough, Goodwin. You're drunk and causing a disturbance. I'm putting you in a cell until you sober up. Theodore's face contorted with rage. You can't do that. She's my wife. I have rights. Not for much longer, Eliza said, finding her voice at last. I'm filing for divorce next week. Theodore lunged forward, but Porter intercepted him, twisting his arm behind his back. Threatening your wife in front of the sheriff, Porter said, disgust evident in his voice. Not your brightest move. As Porter dragged Theodore away, the man shouted obscenities that made Eliza flush with shame. Mason gently guided her toward the wagon. I'm sorry, he said. Shouldn't have brought you to town. No, Eliza replied, straightening her shoulders. I needed to face him. Now everyone knows what kind of man he truly is. They completed their errands, quickly supplies from the general store, a visit to the doctor who confirmed Eliza's pregnancy was progressing normally, and a stop at the dressmaker's to commission maternity clothes with the last of Eliza's saved money. On the return journey, they were both quiet, processing the confrontation. Finally, Mason broke the silence. What he said about you, it wasn't right, Eliza sighed. No, but it wasn't unexpected. Theodore always lashed out when cornered. Still, folks in town heard. It's not fair to your reputation. My reputation was compromised the moment I agreed to stay with you, Eliza pointed out. Not that I regret it. You saved my life. Mason's hands tightened on the reins. There's a solution if you'd consider it. He took a deep breath. After your divorce is final, you could marry me. Eliza turned to him in shock. Mason, you can't be serious. It's not as crazy as it sounds, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. You need a safe place for you and your child. I need help with the ranch. It could be a partnership, nothing more. A marriage of convenience, Eliza asked, stunned by the suggestion. Mason nodded. Exactly, you'd have my name, my protection. The child would have a father, and when you're ready to move on, I wouldn't stand in your way. Eliza studied his profile, trying to understand this enigmatic man. Why would you do this? Mason was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, 3 years ago, before that blizzard, I was engaged. Annie was everything I wanted, smart, beautiful, kind. His voice grew tight. She died of fever while I was gone. By the time I recovered and made it back, she'd been in the ground a month. I'm so sorry, Eliza whispered. Mason shrugged, the gesture at odds with the pain evident in his eyes. After that, I figured I was done with marriage. Focused on building the ranch instead, he glanced at her. I'm not offering love, Eliza. I don't have that in me anymore, but I can offer respect, partnership, and a safe home for your child. The proposition hung between them for the remainder of the journey. Eliza's mind whirled with implications. Marriage to Mason would solve many practical problems, but could she enter such a union without love? After Theodore's betrayal, the idea of trusting any man seemed foolhardy. Yet as they approached the ranch, Eliza found herself seeing it through new eyes, not as a temporary refuge, but as a potential home. In just 2 weeks, She'd come to appreciate the quiet rhythm of life here, the honest work and Mason's steady presence. "I need time to think," she said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Of course," Mason replied. "It's not a decision to make lightly." That evening, Eliza sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky. The beauty of this wild land still took her breath away. Boston, with its brick buildings and crowded streets, seemed like another lifetime. Here, the vastness of sky and land made human concerns seem smaller, more manageable. Mason joined her, offering a cup of tea before sitting in the adjacent chair. They watched the colors fade in comfortable silence. "I'll accept your proposal," Eliza said finally. After the divorce is final, Mason turned to her, surprise evident in his face. "You're sure? I don't want you to feel obligated." "I'm sure," Eliza replied, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, this is truly a partnership. I won't be treated as a servant or a possession." Mason nodded. "Agreed." "Second, although this isn't a love match, I expect fidelity. I won't share my husband with other women." "I wouldn't dishonor you that way," Mason said firmly. Eliza hesitated before voicing her final condition. "And third, if feelings should develop between us, we won't deny them out of fear or obligation to our original agreement." Mason studied her for a long moment. "That's fair," he said finally, "though I should warn you I'm not much for romantic gestures." A small smile touched Eliza's lips. "I've had enough empty romance to last a lifetime. I prefer honesty." They sealed their unusual agreement with a handshake, and Eliza felt a curious sense of rightness settle over her. This was not the future she had imagined for herself, but perhaps it was the one she needed. The following week brought unexpected developments. Judge Willoughby arrived in Westcliff early, and Eliza's divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Theodore, facing potential charges for abandonment and public drunkenness, suddenly became eager to dissolve the marriage. When offered the choice between a quiet divorce or public humiliation, he chose the former, signing the papers without contest. Just like that, Eliza was free, a divorced woman at 22, expecting a child and engaged to a man she barely knew. "Are you still certain about this?" Mason asked as they rode home from the courthouse. "The divorce is final. You could start fresh somewhere else if you wanted." "Where would I go?" Eliza asked. "Who would hire a divorced, pregnant woman? No, I've made my decision." She placed a hand on her growing belly. "This child deserves stability, and I believe you'll provide that." 2 days later, they returned to town for a brief civil ceremony. Sheriff Porter and his wife stood as witnesses. Eliza wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her pregnancy. Mason had purchased a simple gold band that now encircled her finger, a symbol of a union formed from necessity rather than passion. As summer faded into autumn, Eliza settled into her role as Mrs. Jackson. The ranch demanded constant attention, and she found satisfaction in making the cabin more comfortable. She planted a small vegetable garden, repaired worn linens, and added feminine touches to what had been a decidedly masculine home. Mason worked from dawn till dusk, returning each evening tired but generally content. He was unfailingly respectful, treating Eliza with a quiet courtesy that, while not romantic, made her feel valued. They shared meals and conversation, gradually learning each other's histories and habits. Eliza discovered that Mason had been raised in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. He'd fought briefly for the Union during the Civil War, then headed west seeking land and independence. He was 34, 12 years her senior, but the age difference seemed irrelevant given the nature of their arrangement. For his part, Mason learned of Eliza's sheltered upbringing in a wealthy Boston family, her passion for books, and her disappointment when her parents refused to allow her to attend college. Her marriage to Theodore had been partly rebellion, partly genuine belief in his promises of adventure and equality in the West. "He changed once we were married," Eliza explained one evening as they sat by the fire, "or perhaps he simply showed his true nature." "Either way, I became property rather than partner." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Some men are like that, think a ring gives them ownership." "And you?" Eliza asked boldly. "What kind of husband would you have been to Annie?" Pain flickered across Mason's face at the mention of his lost fiancée, but he considered the question. "I like to think I'd have been fair. Annie had strong opinions, wasn't afraid to speak her mind. I admired that about her." As you should, Eliza said. A wife should be more than an ornament or servant. Mason's lips quirked in a rare smile. You're certainly more than that, Eliza Jackson. This place hasn't run so smoothly since, well, ever. The casual compliment warmed her more than it should have. As her pregnancy advanced, Eliza found herself increasingly aware of Mason as a man, his strength as he worked around the ranch, his gentleness when helping her with tasks that had become difficult, the quiet rumble of his voice reading aloud in the evenings. These observations embarrassed her. Their arrangement was practical, not romantic. Yet sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something beyond mere concern for her well-being. In those moments, Eliza wondered if their third condition might someday come into play. As September turned to October, Eliza's time drew near. Her body felt unwieldy, her back ached constantly, and sleep became elusive. Mason insisted on hiring Mrs. Hollister, a midwife from Westcliff, to stay at the ranch for the final weeks. I won't risk you being alone when your time comes, he said firmly when Eliza protested the expense. Mrs. Hollister, a no-nonsense widow in her 60s, arrived with a trunk full of supplies and immediate opinions about the household. You need more rest, she informed Eliza after one day. And you, she turned to Mason, need to stop letting her overwork herself. I've tried telling her that, Mason defended himself. Men, Mrs. Hollister muttered. Useless in these matters. Despite her brusque manner, the midwife's presence was reassuring. She showed Mason how to construct a proper cradle, supervised the preparation of the birthing room, and spent hours teaching Eliza what to expect. On October 12, as the first snow dusted the distant mountains, Eliza's labor began. The pains started gradually in the early morning, intensifying by midday. Mason paced anxiously outside the bedroom door as Mrs. Hollister attended to Eliza. It could be hours yet, the midwife told him unsympathetically. Go make yourself useful somewhere else. The labor progressed steadily through the afternoon and into the evening. Eliza, who had imagined herself facing childbirth with stoic dignity, found herself crying out with each intensifying contraction. The pain was beyond anything she had anticipated, wave after relentless wave that left her gasping and exhausted. You're doing fine, Mrs. Hollister assured her. First babies take their time. As midnight approached, Eliza felt her strength waning. I can't, she sobbed after a particularly vicious contraction. I can't do this anymore. The bedroom door opened and Mason stepped in, ignoring Mrs. Hollister's protests. He knelt beside the bed, taking Eliza's hand in his. Yes, you can, he said firmly. You're the strongest woman I know, Eliza Jackson. You survived being abandoned at a crossroads. You rebuilt your life. This baby will be lucky to have you as a mother. His unexpected presence and words gave Eliza a second wind. She gripped his hand as another contraction seized her. Don't leave, she gasped. I'm not going anywhere, Mason promised, and for once Mrs. Hollister didn't argue. In the gray hours before dawn, after 18 hours of labor, Eliza delivered a healthy son. The baby's angry cry filled the room and Mrs. Hollister cleaned him efficiently before placing him in Eliza's arms. Perfect, the midwife pronounced. All fingers and toes accounted for. Eliza stared in wonder at the tiny face. Despite her exhaustion, joy bubbled up inside her. Hello, little one, she whispered. Mason stood beside the bed, an unreadable expression on his face. He's beautiful, he said hoarsely. Eliza looked up at him, sudden uncertainty clouding her happiness. This wasn't Mason's child. Would he resent this living reminder of her past? Would you like to hold him? She asked tentatively. Mason hesitated, then carefully took the swaddled infant. His large hands looked incongruous cradling the tiny bundle, but he held the baby with surprising confidence. What will you name him? He asked, gently touching the wisp of dark hair on the baby's head. Eliza hadn't given much thought to names. During her pregnancy, she'd avoided thinking too far ahead, afraid to invite disappointment. Now, watching Mason hold her son with such care, she knew. William, she said. William Mason Jackson, she paused, if that's all right with you. Mason's eyes met hers, something raw and vulnerable visible in them for the first time since she'd known him. You want to give him my name, my full name? You're his father now, Eliza said simply, in every way that matters. Mason swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'd be honored." Mrs. Hollister cleared her throat. "Touching as this is, the new mother needs rest." She shooed Mason from the room, promising to call him if needed. In the quiet aftermath, as Eliza nursed her son for the first time, she reflected on the strange path that had led her here. 6 months ago, abandoned and desperate, she could never have imagined this moment exhausted but triumphant, with a healthy child and a husband who, while not a lover, had shown more care than Theodore ever had. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and new routines. Will, as they began calling him, was a hearty baby with a powerful set of lungs. Eliza was grateful for Mrs. Hollister's continued presence as she recovered from the birth and learned to care for her son. Mason threw himself into fatherhood with unexpected enthusiasm. He would often take Will from Eliza's tired arms in the evening, walking the colicky baby around the cabin until he settled. He built a rocking chair for the nursery and installed shelves for baby supplies. Every evening, he would read aloud to Will from one of the few books in the house, his deep voice lulling the baby to sleep. "He doesn't understand the words," Eliza pointed out one night, amused by Mason reading agricultural journals to the infant. "Doesn't matter," Mason replied. "It's the sound he likes, and he should know his father's voice." The casual way Mason referred to himself as Will's father touched Eliza deeply. There was no biological connection, no obligation beyond their agreement, yet Mason had embraced the role completely. As winter settled over the ranch, the small family established new patterns. Mrs. Hollister returned to Westcliff, satisfied that mother and baby were thriving. Eliza and Mason worked out a rhythm that allowed each to contribute while ensuring Will was always cared for. The cabin, once merely functional, had become a true home, warm, comfortable, and filled with the sounds of family life. One December evening, as snow fell steadily outside, Eliza sat by the fire nursing Will while Mason mended harness by lamplight. The domestic scene struck her suddenly how far she had come from the desperate woman at the crossroads, how completely her life had transformed in the span of 6 months. "Mason," she said softly. He looked up from his work. I've been thinking about the crossroads where you found me." Mason set aside the harness. "What about it? It seems important somehow, the place where everything changed." She stroked Will's soft cheek as he nursed. "I'd like to see it again." Mason considered her request. "Weather's too harsh now, but come spring we could ride out there if you'd like." Eliza nodded, satisfied. "I'd like that very much." The winter months passed in a peaceful routine. Mason expanded the cabin, adding a proper nursery for Will and making improvements to withstand the harsh Wyoming weather. Eliza took over the household accounts, discovering that while the ranch wasn't prosperous, Mason managed it wisely. With her help organizing supplies and planning for spring planting, they might even turn a small profit in the coming year. Will grew rapidly, his personality emerging stubborn like both his mother's, observant like Mason. By March, he was smiling and reaching for objects, his dark eyes tracking movements around the room. Mason delighted in the baby's development, often spending evenings on the floor with Will, encouraging his attempts to roll over and sit up. Watching them together, Eliza felt a growing warmth toward Mason that went beyond gratitude or friendship. Their marriage of convenience had brought unexpected contentment to her life. Mason was patient, kind, and increasingly open with her, sharing stories of his past and dreams for the ranch's future. Physical affection between them remained limited to occasional touches, Mason's hand at her elbow helping her over rough ground, Eliza straightening his collar before a trip to town. They maintained separate bedrooms, though Eliza sometimes wondered if Mason was as content with their arrangement as he appeared. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born, the vegetable garden sprouted, and Will began attempting to crawl. When May arrived with warm sunshine and wildflowers carpeting the prairie, Mason announced they would make the journey to Dry Creek Crossroads. "Are you sure you want to go back there?" he asked Eliza as they prepared the wagon. "It might bring back difficult memories." Eliza secured 8-month-old Will in a makeshift carrier. "I need to see it again, to remember where our story began." The journey took most of the morning. Will was fussy at first but eventually fell asleep to the rhythm of the wagon. As they approached the crossroads, Eliza felt a curious mixture of dread and anticipation. Would the place still hold the power it had in her memory? Mason brought the wagon to a stop at the exact spot where they'd first met. The landscape looked different in spring sunlight, the barren ground now covered with prairie grasses and flowers, the distant mountains clear against the blue sky. Eliza climbed down carefully, holding Will against her shoulder. She walked to the weathered boulder where she'd sat that fateful evening and touched its rough surface. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said. Mason joined her, looking around at the unremarkable junction of dirt roads. Hard to believe such an important meeting happened in such an ordinary place. Eliza turned to him. "It wasn't ordinary to me. I was certain I would die here." Mason's expression softened. "I'm glad I found you." "So am I," Eliza replied, meaning it more deeply than she could express. They stood in silence for a moment, the prairie wind rustling the grasses around them. Will woke and began fussing, reaching for Mason with chubby hands. Mason took him easily, settling the baby against his broad chest. "I've been thinking," Mason said, bouncing Will gently. "This place, it means something to us. Maybe we should mark it somehow." Eliza tilted her head, curious. "What did you have in mind?" "I own this section of land," Mason explained. "Never did much with it since it's far from the main ranch, but what if we built something here, a small house maybe?" "A house? Here?" Eliza looked around, trying to envision it. Mason nodded. "A place for travelers to rest, maybe even stay the night. There's a spring about a quarter-mile east that runs year-round. Could be a way station between Westcliff and Cheyenne." The idea caught Eliza's imagination. "A safe harbor for travelers," she mused. "I like that." "We could work on it together," Mason continued, growing animated. "Build it piece by piece when we have time, nothing fancy but solid. A place where no one else would be abandoned." Eliza was touched by his understanding of why this place mattered to her. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. The decision made, they spread a blanket on the ground and enjoyed a simple picnic lunch. Will practiced sitting up, toppling over into the soft grass and giggling at his own clumsiness. Mason sketched rough plans for the way station in the dirt with a stick, while Eliza suggested improvements. As the afternoon waned, they packed up to return home. Before climbing into the wagon, Eliza took a final look at the crossroads. "The next time we come here, we'll be building something new," she said. Mason nodded. "A new beginning at the place where we began." Throughout that summer, they made regular trips to the crossroads. Mason had arranged for lumber to be delivered, and slowly, the framework of a small but sturdy building took shape. Eliza surprised herself with her enthusiasm for the project. She'd never imagined herself capable of such physical labor, yet she found satisfaction in learning to hammer nails and raise walls alongside Mason. Will thrived in the open air, content to play in a shaded area while his parents worked. By his first birthday in October, he was taking his first wobbly steps, lurching between Eliza and Mason with delighted squeals. The celebration of Will's birthday marked another milestone, a full year since Mason had entered their lives. Eliza baked a special cake, and they invited Sheriff Porter and his wife, along with a few neighboring ranchers who had become friends. As their guests congratulated them on their fine son, Eliza caught Mason's eye across the room. The shared secret that Will wasn't his biological child had become almost irrelevant. In every way that mattered, Mason was Will's father. That night, after the guests had departed and Will was asleep in his crib, Eliza found Mason on the porch, smoking his pipe and gazing at the stars. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "It was a wonderful day," she said. "Thank you for making it special." Mason tapped his pipe against the railing. "He deserves it, growing up so fast." "A year," Eliza marveled. "It's hard to believe it's been a year since he was born, since we became a family." Mason turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Are you happy, Eliza, with this life?" The question surprised her. "Of course I am. Why do you ask?" Mason shrugged, returning his gaze to the stars. "Sometimes I wonder if you miss your old life, the comforts of the city, society." "I don't miss Boston at all," Eliza said firmly. "And as for society, the people here have been kinder than anyone in my former circles." "No, Mason, I'm content," he nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good, that's good." Eliza hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "And you, are you satisfied with our arrangement?" Mason was quiet for so long that Eliza began to regret her boldness. Finally, he said, I've been thinking about our agreement, the conditions you set. Eliza's heart quickened. Oh, the third one in particular. He turned to face her, his expression serious, about not denying feelings if they developed. I remember, Eliza whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Mason took a step closer. I didn't think it would happen. After Annie, I thought that part of me was dead. He reached out hesitantly, touching Eliza's cheek. But you and Will, you've changed everything. Eliza leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Mason, I love you, Eliza, he said simply. Not just as Will's mother or my partner, I love you as a woman, as my wife. Joy bubbled up inside her. I love you too, she admitted. I have for months, but I was afraid to say anything. Our arrangement seemed to be working, and I didn't want to complicate things. Mason chuckled softly. We've been tiptoeing around each other like skittish colts. His hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. I'd like to be a real husband to you if you'll have me. Yes, Eliza breathed, rising on tiptoes to meet his kiss. Their first true kiss was tentative, then deepening as months of unspoken longing found release. When they finally drew apart, Eliza felt transformed, no longer a woman in a marriage of convenience, but a wife beloved by her husband. That night, Mason moved his belongings into Eliza's room. Their lovemaking was tender, unhurried, a discovery of each other that left Eliza wondering how she had ever thought she could be content with their previous arrangement. Afterward, lying in Mason's arms, Eliza traced the scar on his shoulder, a remnant of his Civil War service. I never thought I could be this happy again, she confessed. After Theodore, I was so afraid to trust. Mason pressed a kiss to her forehead. And I never thought I'd find someone after Annie. Seems we were both wrong. Wonderfully wrong, Eliza agreed. As winter descended once more on Wyoming, the Jackson family settled into their new dynamic. The project at the Crossroads was temporarily halted by snow, but Mason continued working on furniture for the waystation in his workshop. Eliza began keeping a journal of their story, determined that Will should someday know the remarkable circumstances that had brought his parents together. Spring arrived with a special announcement. Eliza was expecting again. The news brought both joy and anxiety. Her first pregnancy had ended with abandonment, and childbirth itself had been terrifying. But Mason's steady support and obvious delight at the prospect of another child eased her fears. Work on the Crossroads building resumed with renewed energy. By June 1877, the structure was complete, a simple but welcoming two-room cabin with a stone fireplace and sturdy porch. They furnished it with a bed, table, chairs, and basic supplies for travelers. A sign hanging from the porch roof read Crossroads Haven in Mason's careful lettering. Word spread quickly about the new way station. Travelers began stopping regularly, mail carriers, cowboys moving cattle, families journeying between settlements. Eliza kept a logbook of visitors and their stories. Some stayed only long enough for a hot meal, others remained overnight. All were welcome, and none were turned away regardless of their ability to pay. As Eliza's pregnancy advanced, she found herself increasingly drawn to the way station. Despite the inconvenience of traveling with a toddler while expecting, she insisted on making regular trips to ensure the haven was properly maintained. There's something healing about this place now, she told Mason. It was once a site of abandonment, but now it's a place of welcome. Mason understood, as he always did. He arranged for a local widow, Mrs. Finch, to help at the way station several days a week, allowing Eliza to fulfill her vision without overtaxing herself. In late October, as the first snow threatened, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Annie Elizabeth Jackson, honoring both Mason's lost fiancée and Eliza's mother. Unlike Will's difficult delivery, Annie's birth was remarkably smooth, lasting only 6 hours from first contraction to the moment she entered the world. She knows her own mind, Mrs. Hollister commented as she placed the squalling infant in Eliza's arms. Going to be a strong-willed one. Mason gazed adoringly at his daughter, his by blood this time, though he made no distinction between his children. Will, now 2 years old and fiercely protective of his position as big brother, peered curiously at the red-faced baby. "Baby Annie," he pronounced solemnly, patting her tiny hand with his pudgy fingers. The winter of 1877-78 tested the young family. Record snowfall isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Will caught a frightening fever in January that left him weak and listless for days. The cattle suffered in the bitter cold, and Mason worked himself to exhaustion caring for the herd. Yet through these trials, Eliza found herself surprisingly content. The cabin was warm and secure, their food stores ample. In the evenings, with Will recovered and playing on the rug, Annie nursing contentedly, and Mason reading aloud from a new book ordered from Denver, Eliza experienced moments of perfect happiness. "We should expand the main house in the spring," Mason announced one such evening. "Add another bedroom for the children, maybe a proper sitting room for you." Eliza smiled at his constant desire to improve their home. "I'd like that, though I was thinking we might make another improvement as well." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Oh." "The Crossroads Haven has been so successful," Eliza explained. "I've been thinking we might expand it too. Add a proper kitchen, maybe rooms for a permanent caretaker." Mason considered the idea. Mrs. Finch might be interested in living there full-time. Her son's family is moving to Colorado, and she's mentioned not wanting to be alone. "Exactly what I was thinking," Eliza said, "and we could add a small store for travelers' necessities. Sheriff Porter mentioned that the stage line is considering using that route more regularly." Mason grinned. "You're becoming quite the businesswoman, Mrs. Jackson." Eliza returned his smile. "I'm learning from my husband." As the snow melted and spring breathed new life into the land, the Jacksons set their plans in motion. Construction began on both properties, expanding the main ranch house and developing Crossroads Haven into a proper rest stop with a small store, permanent caretakers' quarters, and a stable for travelers' horses. Mrs. Finch agreed enthusiastically to become the Haven's full-time manager, bringing her considerable skills as cook and hostess to the enterprise. By summer's end, Crossroads Haven had become a recognized landmark, mentioned on maps and recommended by regular travelers between Cheyenne and Point South. The success of the Haven brought unexpected opportunities. A representative from the Overland Mail Company approached Mason about establishing a regular stop for mail carriers. The additional income allowed the Jacksons to hire help for the ranch, giving them more time to focus on the Haven and their growing family. In the spring of 1879, nearly 4 years after Mason found Eliza at the Crossroads, they stood together on the porch of the now thriving Haven. Will, almost 4, chased butterflies in the wildflowers that surrounded the building. Annie, 18 months old, practiced her walking by clutching her father's fingers. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," Eliza said, watching Mrs. Finch welcome a family of travelers. "From abandonment to this," Mason slipped an arm around her waist. "You built this, Eliza, your vision, your compassion. We built it together," she corrected him. "Everything good in my life came from that terrible moment when Theodore left me here." Mason kissed her temple. "That's the thing about Crossroads. You never know which path will lead you home." As if to emphasize his point, a distant rider appeared on the eastern road, another traveler seeking shelter, another life potentially changed by finding welcome instead of wilderness. "Speaking of home," Mason said, "I have a surprise waiting back at the ranch." Eliza raised her eyebrows. "What kind of surprise? You'll see," he said mysteriously. After ensuring Mrs. Finch had everything under control, they loaded the children into the wagon and headed home. As they approached the ranch, Eliza noticed something new beside the main house, a small structure with windows and a slanted roof. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Mason's eyes twinkled. "Your library." "My what?" Eliza gasped. "I know how much you miss your books," Mason explained as he brought the wagon to a stop. "So I ordered some from Denver and built a place for them." Overwhelmed, Eliza hurried to the new building. Inside, she found shelves lined with books, classics she had mentioned loving, new novels she had expressed interest in, educational books for the children, and practical guides for ranching and homesteading. "Mason," she breathed, running her fingers along the spines. "This must have cost a fortune." "The Crossroads Haven is doing well," he said, following her inside with Annie in his arms and Will at his heels. "We can afford a few luxuries now." Eliza turned to embrace him, careful not to crush Annie between them. "Thank you, it's perfect." Will tugged at her skirt. "Read to me, Mama." Laughing, Eliza selected a colorfully illustrated volume of children's tales and settled into one of the comfortable chairs Mason had placed by the window. As she began reading, with Will leaning against her knee and Mason sitting nearby with Annie, Eliza felt a profound sense of completion. From the desperate woman at the crossroads to the contented wife, mother, and businesswoman she had become, the journey had been unexpected but perfect in its way. She caught Mason's eye over the top of the book and saw in his smile the same contentment, the same certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. As the years passed, Crossroads Haven grew into a proper way station, eventually adding a small schoolhouse that served both travelers' children and those from neighboring ranches. Eliza, drawing on her own thwarted educational ambitions, became the teacher 3 days a week. Will and Annie were joined by a brother, James, born in 1880, and finally a sister, Margaret, in 1883. The Jackson Ranch prospered, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the county. Mason served 2 terms as county commissioner, while Eliza's reputation as an educator and businesswoman earned her respect throughout the territory. They never forgot the unlikely beginning of their life together. Each year on the anniversary of their meeting, Mason and Eliza would visit the crossroads alone, standing on the spot where he had found her. They would remember their separate journeys to that point, Eliza's desperate abandonment, Mason's lonely grief, and marvel at how a moment of kindness had transformed both their lives. And when travelers stopped at Crossroads Haven, tired and hungry and sometimes desperate themselves, they found not just shelter and food, but the living example of what compassion could build, a family forged at an abandoned crossroads, a love that began with a simple offer of help, and a legacy of welcome that would endure for generations to come.